All right, guys. So back to chapters 3 and 4. It seems to me the last slide we discussed was this slide about the 1950s and a return to hard bargaining. And I discussed with you the guy from GE who was a vice president named Boulware and Boulwarism, which was this concept of a firm and final offer. In this same time period came the Landrum-Griffin Act, also known as the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959. The main idea behind this act was to protect union members from the improper conduct of the union management and included a Bill of Rights section for the members. It actually set up what union bosses were allowed to do and required reporting on the financial state of the union. During this time period also, in 1962, Executive Order 10988 was signed. That federal executive order actually gave federal employees the right to collective bargain. The FLRA was an act that was passed by Congress in 1978 that also gave federal employees the right to engage in collective bargaining. So we have some pushback against unions, but then we also have some government support of the right to unionize. It should surprise no one that the 1960s involved a lot of rank-and-file unrest. That rank-and-file unrest was matched with the civil rights movement, the urban riots, the Vietnam War, and a number of other large changes that were coming to our social and economic environment. The 1960s, we had strong economic growth, but we also had a significant amount of social upheaval. We also had the space race, which spawned new technologies, and white-collar jobs became the turning point for the downward spiral in union membership. White-collar workers often do not qualify to be members of unions, or these ones that are in these high-tech industries are able to leverage their skills so that they're no longer in need of joining a union. We also saw in this time period quite a few wildcat strikes. These are strikes that go on without support from the national union. They're not illegal per se, but they're not sanctioned by the national organization. Strikes go up significantly in this time period. People were willing to march for civil rights. They were also willing to march for workers' rights. The 1970s is considered a time of stability for the economy and a time of stability for the social and political orders of our nation. The key word for this time period is status quo. Management was preoccupied with not allowing the unions gain anymore, and the labor unions were preoccupied with just preserving the previous gains. This was considered a time of not very much change, actually. Now, the pressure from foreign competition is just beginning to enter the scenes. And also the idea of offshoring comes in here. So in 1973, we have our first true outsourcing. The airline industries begin to place call centers off of our shores. The first call center I could find in the records began in the Caribbean in 1973. The 1980s are a period of experimentation and change. We elected Ronald Reagan, which reflected a strong conservative shift in the country. While Reagan was president, he fired the PATCO workers. The PATCO workers are the Paternal Air Traffic Controllers Organization. Reagan fired these workers so that we could get air traffic moving again, but this actually decreased the power of the unions. In March 1982, we see the General Motors United Auto Workers, UAW, and the Ford United Auto Workers trading pay and work rule concessions for profit sharing and job security. We'll actually see that in one of the movies we're going to watch later on. The 1980s also had a period of recession and the rise of the dollar. Both of those things decreased our competitiveness and put pressure on unions to give concessions. We saw in 1983, Continental Airlines does away with its bargaining agreement completely and breaks the strike. Also in 1983, American Airlines introduces a B scale or a two-tiered pay system. That's actually the same thing that John Deere uses now for its union workers in the assembly and welding parts of the organization. Because of all of this pressure, union membership declines, and unions have to experiment. They begin to focus on giving concessions for job security. As a child growing up in Arizona, I saw personally the impact that this had on workers in the mining industry. Copper mines in Arizona, Texas, and other places around the country owned by the Phelps Dodge Agency actually experienced strikes with their workers. This was in the 1980 to 1986 range, and the National Guard was brought in. When I was a young child in, I think, 1982 or 83, the National Guard was brought into Arizona, and guns were pointed at workers on strike in the copper mines. The 1980s begins a move towards polarization. That word seems to be even indicative of what we hear going on today. The polarization here begins to be more and more the bosses against the workers. Downsizing and re-engineering lead to layoffs, insecurity, and income bifurcation, which really just means an income gap between the lowest and the highest. Security concerns lead to low wage increases. Some companies have participatory plans where workers actually can engage in conversation with the businesses, but then we continue to have conflictual relationships between labor and bosses, such as at Caterpillar. Caterpillar actually was the case study for how conflictual a relationship can be between the bosses and the workers when I was an undergrad student. The non-union sector continues to grow in the 1990s. We see more and more outsourcing, more contingent workers, meaning workers who are working on a sort of part-time basis, or marginal workers, or workers working through companies like Manpower, where they don't actually work for the hotel that they're cleaning. They're working for Manpower, who subs them out to the hotel, and so on. Also, lax enforcement of laws hurts unionization. So there's a lot of pressure on unions at this time period, and union membership declines. The 2000s to the current. So we see challenges of the new millennium. The bifurcation continues and in fact deepens. The wealth gap and the income gaps have expanded. Recent economic pressures have increased the variety of employment practices across the U.S. The differences between the union and the non-union sectors become more and more stark. The 1990s are characterized by a sense of hypermobility in the job market for people like computer programmers and related professionals who easily moved across firms in order to take advantage of attractive stock options. Highly skilled employees gained substantial individual bargaining power, which led to increases in their earnings. Faced with a growing non-union sector, the American labor movement increased efforts to revitalize. The expansion of international trade and the accelerated expansion of multinational corporations extended markets internationally and challenged the international labor movement to forge cross-national unionism. In other words, the globalization of unions. And we'll see some of that also when we watch one of our movies coming up. Debates on the virtues of the market-driven U.S. economy system shifted with the bursting of the dot-com bubble, the corporate finance scandals such as Enron and WorldCom, and other U.S. major corporations in 2000 and 2002. We see new areas attempt to unionize, such as doctors, teaching assistants, college athletes, and so on. The time period from 2008 through 2010, when we were experiencing recession again recently, saw a greater divide in income and in wealth. And you see the rise of socialism as a potential reaction to what is seen as an unequal system. So the value of collective bargaining, why would it be important to have? The key contribution is to political democracy. The right to form unions and the right to carry out strikes is an essential component of political democracy. In other words, it gives the workers an opportunity to have a voice and to have some protections from the employers. The need for the right to strike is also important. The freedom to enter a contract also requires the freedom to reject a contract. The right to negotiate and the right to strike are closely related. Also, through collective bargaining, employers and employees better understand the problems that the other side faces. When they have these conversations, they can generate better solutions for each of the parties. In most states, employment at will is the law that rules the land. This doctrine stipulates that employees and employers are free to end the employment relationship at any time, for any reason, and without liability, provided that the termination does not violate any statutory or constitutional provisions, which primarily means that we're not firing somebody due to their protected status. So this means non-union employees do not have any recourse if they are fired from a company. This employment at will concept governs every employment relationship not covered by labor and employment laws. Courts have applied the employment at will doctrine to any cases where there is no written contract, no specified term of employment, and no employee handbook. They have also applied the employment at will doctrine when an employee handbook is insufficient to establish exceptions to the at will doctrine. In other words, if the employee handbook does not provide enough guidance, the courts will automatically assume an at will relationship. Also, if there's an expired union contract, the courts will treat that relationship as employment at will until the contract is put back into place. Remember, employment at will means you can be fired without cause. Employment law is different than labor law. Employment law applies to cases where we don't have labor unions or union bargaining agreements. So society has regulated certain employment conditions directly. These regulations include provisions for overtime, minimum wages, unemployment insurance, pensions, and other things. The Fair Labor Standard Act of 1938 includes many of these key regulations. Things such as child labor restrictions, minimum wage, and so on are a part of that act. Seniority systems are also considered legal as long as they are non-discriminatory. Employment law also includes the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is often called Equal Opportunity Employment, provided regulation on promotion, transfer, seniority, and other terms of employment. It prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin when it comes to employment and any kind of public accommodation. The Age Discrimination Act became part of our regulatory environment in 1967. Age protections include anybody 40 years or older. So we cannot discriminate against you based on your age if you are 40 years and older. The Occupational Safety and Health Act came in 1970. This established on-the-job safety and health regulations and granted inspection and enforcement authority to the Department of Labor. This is to protect the workers from exposure to hazards in the workplace. Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed in 1972. Title IX extended protection to all federally funded agencies. This was actually brought about because women were wanting to get jobs in higher education. ERISA, ERISA passed in 1974, which established minimum standards for private pension plans. The American Disabilities Act passed in 1990. It made it unlawful for employers to discriminate against a qualified individual with a disability. It requires reasonable accommodation for that person to be able to do their job. The Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993 requires companies with 50 or more employees to grant up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave per year for health, child, or family care needs to all individuals. In 2002, Title IX gets amended to stop discrimination in any education program or sport based on gender. Other things have begun to come into play. We see some states offering protection based on genetic traits. About 12 states and the District of Columbia have protections against discrimination for sexual orientation, and we also have some states that have protection for those that have served in the military, as some of those folks have been discriminated against historically. So, finishing off chapters 3 and 4, we see a dynamic relationship between labor and management. They're responding to legislation, and legislation is responding to the conditions that they see in that relationship. History reveals the critical influence of law and public policy on the evolution and conduct of collective bargaining and other forms of the industrial relations in our country. The National Labor Relations Act is the key labor law that governs collective bargaining. Thank you, and I'll see you again soon.